Well, good morning, neighbors. How are you? You ready to have at it? It's 10 minutes past the hour on this fine, gorgeous Tuesday morning, 13th day of February, the year 2018. Coming to you live from the garden spot of the universe. We are in West Keene, New Hampshire, tucked in the corner of Cheshire County, southwestern New Hampshire, in New England, the finest part of these great United States. To join me on the program, 357-1290. Email is Dan at WKBKRadio.com. It is our last open phone line, open mic of the week. Tomorrow on Valentine's Day, we'll bring in that romance expert. Celeste Longacre will be here to do astrological readings. It's cool to have her on St. Valentine's Day. Thursday, What's Cooking with Luca, and it's the John McGauley Show for you on Friday. So what's on your mind? We've been talking about internet and internet availability or lack thereof here in the Monadnock region and its importance. The president wants to overhaul our infrastructure, and he wants, well, not Mexico, he wants you to pay for it. We'll talk about that, and not one person, at least through email, agreed with my opinion that we need to go back to the official, the old-fashioned school district meetings that we had, the town meeting style, as opposed to the official ballot or SB2 or the Australian ballot. A lot of you told me I was wrong, and that's okay. You know, you and my wife have something in common. We'll get to those emails in a second. You're on the radio. What's on your mind?
Good morning, Dan. It's Coney and Solid here. Had some thoughts on the SB2 versus the town hall system.
Now, for those folks who don't know, you're the person who did the 3 petition articles that they talked about on Saturday. 3 of them will be on the warrant. Only one of them will exist in its original form, correct?
Correct. You know, I've been doing this. This is the 6th year I've gone to these meetings. I've put warrants together pretty much every one of those years. I've been basically throwing everything at the wall and trying to see what sticks. In my opinion, I think you've heard it many, many times, the problem we have in this community is spending. And I'm trying to get that under wraps. I mean, the spending is what is hurting our community so badly. It's what's running our kids off. It's what's making it hard to live here. And if we want to fix the problem, the answer to life, the universe, and everything here in Keene is to get the spending under control, and that's basically what I'm trying to do. When I put that warrant together, my idea was to get the people at the first meeting, because that's the meeting that counts. People think that when they go to the meeting in March, that they're actually doing their due diligence as a citizen of Keene, and that they're doing their part. But in actuality, the ballot has already been stacked in the favor of the school. So it's like, why even go in March? The ballot has already been decided. The most important event to attend is that February meeting, which very sadly was the worst in attendance that I've ever been to, 77 voters. And the idea is to get people there when the actual numbers are being discussed. I would like to think that going back to SB2 is going to be the answer. If you went by the response of the school board members who spoke against it and the administrators who spoke against it, I'm going to say that out of everything I've ever brought to the table, I think this has them more scared than anything else. I think they know something. I think that they know that filling that auditorium to capacity is going to, first of all, put them on the hot seat, but it might actually get more of these individuals who think they're making a difference in March in the room in February. But you're asking for people who might disagree with it, and I do have my doubts, and here's why. 77 voters. The voter apathy in this country is horrific, and I don't know the reason why. I think part of it might be because of guilt. You speak a lot about the highest employers in Keene. And, of course, Cheshire Medical is at the top of the list, and right below that is CNS. But we never really talk about the 3rd and the 4th highest employers in Keene. Do you know who they are?
Public school system and the college.
Correct. The school district, according to nhes.nh.gov, says that the school district, the Keene School District, employs 1,141 employees. And keep in mind that, and they don't all live in Keene, but a good portion of them probably do. And a good portion of them probably know at least 5 people who would vote favorably for them because it's their paycheck. So basically what has happened is you have an awful lot of individuals who basically they're on the school dole. It's in their favor to vote for these higher budgets every year, for these teachers' raises and these principal raises and whatnot every single year, because it's in their favor. What they don't realize, of course, is that they have become parasites. They are basically sucking down more nutrients from their host than they are giving back, and they are slowly strangling their host to death. They are strangling their community to death with these high raises. The return on investment isn't there. Maybe 30 years ago, when they were spitting out kids at a decent rate for a decent amount of investment, but now, I'm sorry, almost $20,000 per student per year. That's insane. That is absolutely insane. That's $250,000 to educate a kid. And half of these kids couldn't pass an entrance exam in the local college. They just couldn't.
All right, let's remind people you're listening to Open Mike, calling into the program this morning, Conan Saladay. He is a gentleman that has 3 petition articles on the warrant this year. 2 of them have been dramatically changed from what they were originally written, and that's what can happen at a first session. At the second session, which is the voting on March 13th, folks will be able to vote on those, plus the 3rd petition warrant article, which has to do with rescinding SB2, or the official or Australian ballot way of funding the schools, voting and deciding on the schools. It would go back to the old town hall meeting. Let me address a couple of issues, and part of this is, I'll read a part of an email. When we went through this back prior to 1996, and a lot of people got fired up about bringing the Australian ballot, there were a lot of people who thought the way that you did, that the city of Keene, through education, was spending way too much money, that it was difficult to greatly alter budgets or to basically try to control the spending. There were very well-organized taxpayers groups, one in particular in the city of Keene, that had a lot of members, that brought a lot of people to the school district meeting. So many so that they were able to go with a very new proposal that had occurred in the state of New Hampshire. The state of New Hampshire first had to allow SB2, and once it did, Keene was one of the first communities to adopt it for their school spending. And it was this taxpayer group that really ushered it in, and they gave the exact same argument that you gave about doing away with it now. And I'm not saying that your explanation isn't right, but it was the whole idea in part that the teachers and that administrators and other people employed by the school district and their spouses and their friends had too much control at these meetings, and that by going to the Australian ballot, that more people would go and vote, and that they'd have greater control over the budget. And get this, they suggested that people would be more informed because they wouldn't have to go to a meeting and hear the arguments back and forth and have to make some sort of a vote before they left, that they would all do their homework, and they would go to the first session to make the changes, and the second session is where they'd vote. And the idea was to try to control spending. Now, what we've seen since 1996 is spending has gone up. No budgets have been rejected. Only one teacher's contract, I think, has been rejected. And now, instead of having 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 people participate in the process, at the first session we just had 77 people. So your argument about reversing the course, I get and I understand, but it's the same argument that brought us to this point in the first place.
Like I said, Dan, I'm just seeing what sticks. I know that 22 years ago, I probably would have been in favor of that, all of what you just said. And now, but we know that it doesn't work, mostly because of that pesky default budget that kicks in.
Right.
I think that was the worst that a lot of people probably didn't realize at the time. But I'm not arguing in favor of taking it back to town hall. I know that it would be better. I know that the spending there will be more control over the spending. You might get more of those March voters in who vote against these bills in the building. But because of that high population of Keene State or Keene School District employees, they're going to amass their numbers, and they're going to be going back, and going back to town hall is not going to fix the problem. Plain and simple. It'll be better, but it's not going to fix the problem. Sadly. Let me read this sentence to you from a person who is not in favor of going back to the old way, saying,
How exactly will changing the meeting style guarantee the seats in the auditorium will be filled the way they used to? It's a good question. Why will people now, just given how they ignore the public process of being able to control their spending, how will we know that more people will go and participate than they do now at the first session if they go back to the town hall meeting?
Well, one thing that has changed, and I think, could you refresh me? One of the Sentinels did a 25 years ago article about what school spending was 25 years ago.
It was
It
was $22 million. It was about $22 to $23 million.
Okay, that's the difference. The difference is that it's close to $70 million this year. It's close to $67 million this year. That's a huge difference. That might get people in the auditorium in February. Just that number. Me continually calling in and reminding people about how much per student that the school is spending, and how much of those students aren't actually getting a good education.
Well,
it really is, like I was quoted. It really is daycare for many of the kids.
All right, so
now, some of those kids are getting a good education. I think, in your girls, for example, went in there and got what they paid into. But most of the kids, it's just daycare for their parents.
Well, let's get to that point, because that's the other note that I scratched down quickly when I knew it was you when you called in to the program. Do you think, and I've heard this from more than a few people, that, and you've been at it a long time, and I understand you get frustrated, but when you say some of the things that you say, it riles some people, and I think it makes your argument less valid because of your tone and tenor. Public education isn't perfect, but I know a lot of families and a lot of people whose kids have gone through the local school system in SAU 29 and then Keene High School. And I can't think of many that either didn't graduate or go on to college, or at least not living pretty successful lives now. My point is, I argue or dispute what you say about most of the kids are not well educated. Most of the kids couldn't pass an entry exam. First of all, there's no such thing as an entrance exam for college. Second of all, colleges are so desperate to get people in that virtually anybody, even Donald Trump, could make it into a college nowadays. And we know that's saying something.
Yeah, the colleges in this country are another scam.
Well, but my point is, don't you think, if you're trying to convince people to do something, this is more of a personal note, that you should be a little bit more careful about how you deliver the message? Because the Keene school system, and frankly, SAU 29 and the other, Conval and Jaffrey Ringe, are graduating pretty decent human beings. And that what it is compared to inner city schools and a lot of other places with problems, that we're doing pretty well. And the reason my daughters have done well is in part because they have an education that's available to them that's good, but it's also because of parenting. I'm not patting myself on the back, but a kid is only as good as his parents. And that's not the school's issue, and that's not the city's issue. That's the idiots at home's issue.
What I'm saying, Dan, is it seems like your daughters are in a position, and you know people who are in a position to take advantage of the school system. They are going to take it to other places, but not everyone is going to be a nurse. We need our plumbers, and we need our carpenters, and those individuals don't necessarily need to focus all of their attention on calculus or on foreign languages. And
they know that, and they realize that, and that's why we're lucky to have the Cheshire Career Center. And they're not required to take physics or calculus. They're not required to take anything really other than the basics, which is English or writing, in language and reading interpretation, and some math. Not a lot of math, and by the way, they can take easy math if they want to. I wish I had that available when I was in high school, because I suffered in math. But it's not Sweden, but I think here in Keene they have programs that will direct young people to the tech school in Concord, or they can go through the Cheshire Career Center and get a job at one of the industries right here in town, right out of high school. And by the way, those industries are also very happy to help them intern there or to help them apprentice at these places because they're so desperate for that sort of help. So, yes, it costs a lot to educate the students here, but it costs a lot to educate them everywhere. And again, my point is, I don't think you have to speak so negatively of them to get what you want, is what I'm saying. You can argue, and you may.
I don't see myself as talking negatively. I'm being realistic. I'm telling the facts the way that I see them.
And because of that, I think a lot of people will shun you and your argument. I didn't say you were necessarily wrong or inaccurate with some of the things, but it's about how to get people to go along with you, how to make friends and influence people.
These teacher unions, they're holding their hand down the process is never going to fix it. That's what I've been doing. They are never going to vote down these budgets because it's their paycheck. They might agree with me after the meeting, like, oh, I'm glad you asked all those great questions. I'm glad that you're all about democracy and whatnot. I'm glad you put all that time in and collected all those signatures. Good for you, but I'm going to go ahead and vote my salary up this year. Every single year. Holding their hand down this process is not going to work. It's going to take someone to stand up and actually lay the facts down like they are and tell them that they are the problem. Not part of the problem, they are the problem.
Well, let me ask you that. Let's talk about the teachers. And again, this goes back. Remember, I've been covering this for 35 years, and I've seen both sides when it comes to how they voted on things in Keene. And there was a time on the radio, and again, just for full disclosure, my dad was a teacher for 25 years, and my mother-in-law was a teacher even longer than that. So that's part of ingrained in how I was raised and brought up. When we used to have these arguments, 1984, 85, 86, 88, 90 on the air, before SB2 came along, teachers' starting pay in Keene, I want to say, was like $13,000 a year. Teachers were incredibly underpaid, and you'd never hear me say anything against quality teachers and what they deserve to get paid. Somebody could probably come up with a tape of me 25 years ago saying that teachers ought to get paid as much as lawyers, given the amount of education that they need and the point that they have to put up with all the little pains in the asses that people send to these schools nowadays, that they deserve to get paid that much. How do you balance paying a professional person with all the other expenses that you have in a school system?
You mean like those other employees? Because it's not just teachers. Everyone, when I complain about the budget, everyone thinks I want to fire teachers. 1,141 employees. It's the bus drivers. It's the crosswalk ladies. It's the
bus
administrators.
drivers. The bus drivers. Bus drivers not employed by the school district, but I understand what you're saying.
Maybe not in that list, but that's an awful lot of employees. So it's not just teachers. Everyone is getting a raise every couple of years. So it is the Keene Educational Industrial Complex.
I understand that, but doesn't every human being deserve a raise every year? At least the good, hardworking ones.
If they're efficient and productive at their jobs and are actually if the return on investment is actually worth it, then yes. Especially yes, but I mean, just because they're a teacher, no. It's the same thing if you're a police officer or a fireman. If you're not actually providing the services.
You shouldn't have used those two as an example of people who get raises every year either.
Well, exactly, and they're the other people in this community who are going to insist on raising their salaries every year because they're the heroes. And people are going to go along with it because that's what they hear on the radio. They're like, "Oh, Dan says they're a hero, and they're putting their life out there on the line for us. Let's give them a raise." But are they actually doing what people say that they're doing?
Yeah.
There are plenty of heroes out there. It's not just police, fire, and school teachers or in military.
I know. I know.
Everyone should have a line down their road according to whatever color that they agree with.
Let me ask you this. And again, you could take my advice or not about being a nice guy or being, a pain or seen as being a person that people don't want to agree with. And I've had these discussions with Ian before, relative to the way he addresses libertarian issues or have in the past, or other people that are like-minded. And, there's a right way to go about getting support, and there's a wrong way about going to get support. And I'm suggesting to you that maybe calling the schools daycare wasn't the best way to do that. But my question is, do you know enough people? Why is it so hard? All you needed to do is have 40 people on your side, in addition to the people who voted in favor of not changing your first two amendments or voted against those amendments. How hard is it? Why is it so hard to get just 40 more people that feel the same way that you do to get to that meeting this past Saturday?
Hey, that's what I opened the conversation with, the voter apathy. I don't understand it, but the school was having the same problem. It wasn't just the Liberty folk. It wasn't just the people trying to get the budget down. The school was having the same problem. So I don't know what the deal is. And that's what I said. I think it's guilt. I think that more and more people, when it comes to being out in the open and voicing their opinion, I think they know that there's a problem. They know that there's a problem, but they don't want to actually be in a room and try to defend it. They don't want to defend what they know is a problem. So they, as long as they're in a voter booth where they can vote secretly, they'll go ahead and do it.
Yeah.
But try to get them on the phone and defend it. No.
Yeah. And that was part of the argument too, where people thought with the Australian ballot that there wouldn't be repercussions, that they'd say, "Oh, you're Jack Smith's kid. I'm going to flunk you." Not that teachers would do that, but there was a lot of animosity that was building, especially the year that the teachers' contracts were voted down, and then they pulled the blue flu the next day. And I'll get to that in a moment. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that part of the history. And we touched upon this. I've touched upon it I don't know how many times in the last 2 decades, and you've touched upon it too, with the default budget. Part of the thing that people were afraid of at these school district meetings is the repercussions of talking against education, or talking against the administration, or talking against adding a sport, or anything that could be viewed negatively. So they thought by voting in private in the polls, that they'd be exempt from that. Then along came the default budget, which means that you had a choice of the budget that the school board wanted or the budget that the school board wanted last year. And I've mentioned this in all the years that I do those interviews right before the first session and then again before the second session, when I have the people in from the SAU and from the Keene School District to go over all the articles on the budget. I always would ask them, so if the budget fails, what happens? Well, there is the opportunity to use the default budget. What people don't realize, and this is something that has been changed, and by the way, could be altered at that first session, where somebody could add an article to the warrant that suggests that the default budget not be used and that they come back in a month to come up and vote on another budget. That was new, and that wasn't an original part of the Australian ballot, was to always use the default budget. You could go in the voting booth, turn down a $60 million budget, and the school board would have to go back to work and come up with another figure. I'm not sure people realize that. That the default budget isn't a law that says it has to be used. That's what the school board says to get you to vote for the other budget. And back when we had the town meeting,
I was not aware of that at all.
Back at town meeting, when they did it that way, let's say the budget was $50 million. All those in favor, aye. All those nay. All the nays have it. The budget fails. Then somebody would have to make an amendment, try to figure out why the budget failed, and either add money or subtract it. They'd vote again. If it failed, they'd vote again. If it kept failing, they would vote to adjourn the meeting. The school board would go back to the drawing board. They'd get together in 2 weeks and vote on another budget number. What I'm saying is you could actually reject a budget, and if your idea was you wanted it lower, you could get it lowered. When, during the official ballot system, has that ever been an option? An option that people know about? I'm guessing never.
Yeah, I thought you were talking about the official ballot system. I didn't know. Yeah, that makes sense. You could do that at the town hall system.
But now you don't. The default budget doesn't have to be used. If enough people were mad and showed up at these meetings and said, "No, we reject that budget. We don't want you to spend that much money," the school board would have to listen, or they'd all get voted out of office. Because what sense does it make to even spend the time offering people a budget if it passes automatically or a higher budget passes? Think about that. Why not just have an autonomous school board?
Oh, you mean like the clowns in city council?
Well, see. There you go. You didn't have to say that. You didn't have to call.
You know what? They're not. Let me rephrase, because one of the councilors got on the last time I said that. They're not all clowns. A lot of them mean well. I just don't think a lot of them know what they're doing.
And
you called in. He's a clown.
You could have said that way. I appreciate the time, and maybe I'm sure we'll talk about it again. And whenever you hear people calling in and we're talking about it between now and March 13th, you're welcome to do it. Conan Saladay calling into the program this morning, launching us along in our conversation about the SB2 or official ballot way that the City of Keene School District now decides matters, compared to an option that they used to have, which was the town meeting style of voting on it, and an option they could have again if it is voted in the affirmative. By the way, also, Conan, you know that it needs 60% of the vote in order to change it back. So not only do you have to get the majority, You have, not only do you need the majority, you need to get 3/5 majority in order for it to revert back. I appreciate your time, Conan. Thanks a lot. And the advice, maybe a little more honey than vinegar when it comes to trying to get the things that you want. But again, if only, 500, 600, 800 people show up on March 13th to actually vote on all this stuff, you got to get people to the first session. And nobody goes anymore. And I don't think it's a valid excuse to say, well, it's because nothing ever changes. It's not true. It only changes when, A, you're in the majority, and B, you get the people to go to join you there at the meeting. You mean to tell me that there aren't more than 100 people in the city of Keene that think their property taxes are too high? You think it's only like 20 people that think property taxes are too high? Now, they may blame the county, they may blame the state, they may blame the city government too. I think most people are educated well enough to know that the biggest chunk of their tax bill is the school chunk, right? 357-1290 WKBK. You're on the radio. Thanks for waiting. Good morning.
Hey, good morning. It's a kind of a touchy subject, I guess. I kind of look at it like this. A lot of people are intimidated. They're afraid to, I think, with these, speaking their voice about, where they stand on reducing this. And, when I was very, very young, I can remember, this was many years ago, but I remember people would say, go get a government job, and even everybody understood that they did not pay well. I mean, you didn't go into being a teacher, even though they're invaluable jobs, and there's some great teachers out there. People didn't go into it to make money, or make a really good living. They did it because they loved being teachers, and a lot of them took moonlight jobs. I can remember. So this thing of deserving, nobody deserves anything, but it's easy to say when it's our taxpayer money, and you don't go to your boss and say, I deserve a raise every year, and I deserve this, and I deserve that. You won't be working there in the real world. And that's the difference. And who was that guy out in the Midwest? When that politician, remember he turned things around, it was out in Wisconsin somewhere. He had people crawling through his windows, and they were teachers. They were the city employees, and he was trying to reduce the budget, and he had the people with him, and they still weren't. It's not an easy thing, Dan. It's not like when you get so big where you have that kind of, with the unions and this and that. It's not easy to just say, oh, well, we're going to reverse this. You have people, and like you said, they're friends and family, and then the media. It depends where they stand, and we know what goes on with them every day. And so it's very difficult, and people just want to balance the budgets. They want to bring them in and reel it in, and they're going to have to do it. But you don't want.
But where are they? Why don't they show up in Keene? You're talking about the last caller said what did he say? 1,200 employees within the school district. There are 17,000 voters registered in the city of Keene.
Intimidation, Dan. You heard it. You heard it from the other guy too. It's true. A lot of people are friends, and then they get to the point where they're like, "Oh, fight City Hall," and they don't want to make enemies, and and that's bad. That's almost like a statist. That's like that's like what do you call it? When you start getting intimidation and that's not good. That's not American. It needs to be reeled in, and I think that. It will happen eventually when people just can't take it anymore. But then again, you don't want to see that because then that gets crazy.
I do have a solution for Keene and the other school districts around here, by the way, in the state of New Hampshire. And we haven't touched on it, and I didn't talk about it with Conan because he's coming at it from a different point of view, trying to make change. But what we're arguing about here, and it's an argument, by the way, that they don't have in a lot of other states, and some folks have probably been wondering why I haven't said this earlier. What makes us a little bit different than a lot of other places is that public education is paid for primarily with property taxes. We get very little assistance from the state, and there are still people that argue over the assistance that we do get at about, $3,500 per student. That, given our tax climate here in the state of New Hampshire, wealthy communities that are property rich, and because of their geography, they're close to a lake, they're close to a mountain, they're close to the ocean, or they're close to Boston, have much more taxable property. They're known as being property wealthy. And it's no problem for them to pay all of their teachers and to build new schools and to have the best of everything. And yet you can drive 50 miles in any direction and find a town that's property poor. And not only can they not fix a leaky roof or hire a teacher that they want to hire to teach mathematics, they can't buy a new police car, they can't buy a new fire truck, they can't fix the holes in their roads. And it's not because they're dumb, and it's not because they don't want these things or recognize that they need to improve things. It's because they don't have a lake, or they're too far north of Boston, or they're not near an interstate highway. And because of that, they'll always be property poor. And because the state requires that we fund a public education, but the state also mandates that you use a local property tax, and their whole remarkable way of trying to assess property and when to assess property and to make people pay for these things, that we're always going to have that intimidation factor. You're always going to have that person afraid to get up at a town meeting, and you're always going to have to decide as an older person, do you want to eat or do you want to pay your property taxes or sell your house and move to Florida where it's a lot more affordable. That what we haven't talked about is the state and the way that it funds or refuses to fund education and still mandates us to pay for it with property taxes. And on the other side, and this hasn't been brought up lately at all, the federal government mandates that local school districts care for the education of everybody between the age of 3 and I think it's 24. Maybe it's 22. It is special education. It's been around for multiple decades, since the 70s. And that they require us, and it's a good idea, to care for those who normally wouldn't be cared from, those who can't get into a private school because of their disability and because of the discrimination that's allowed. That we want to be able to care for and educate our young people that have learning disabilities, physical disabilities, health-related issues. And everybody said, well, what a great idea. And then the federal government said, we'll even pay for 40% of it, where they should have paid for 100% of it. And they've never funded it above 20%. If they had, or if they were to pay back the city of Keene the money they owed them for all the special education dating back over those years, I'm guessing hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. And we're a small town. That's part of the problem, too. Think of the millions of dollars being spent on special education. And it's not that people don't want it and don't want to pay for it or help pay for it. It's a mandate that the federal government doesn't pay for. You take that into account, and the state of New Hampshire not living up to the Claremont lawsuit, it would greatly take the burden off of the local property taxpayer here in the state of New Hampshire. We would never have these arguments.
No, that's wrong. I disagree with that. See, instead of just downsizing with what we need to do, you're just saying let's go to the state for more money. That's wrong.
No, it's going to the state for some money because wait. They mandate it, but you don't think they should have to pay for it? The federal government mandates special education but doesn't pay for it. You think that's fair?
But you're only talking special education now. Let's not do that. Let's talk about the whole.
We're talking about 30% of the budget.
Right, but we're talking.
You can't even get a cut of 2% to the school budget. Can you imagine a cut of 20 or 30%?
All right.
Go ahead. One of the petition articles at the meeting on Saturday was to cap spending. Another was to make sure that it doesn't increase. Well, the cap by more than 1%. 1%. If you were to completely eliminate the special education line items of any school district's budget, that's not to say that we wouldn't have special education. I'm saying that the federal government said, all right, we're going to write you the check. And I know the federal government's still our money. But again, when you divide it amongst millions of people as opposed to 1.1 million, which is the amount of people that live in the state of New Hampshire, it makes it more cost effective. So if you were to eliminate that off the local property tax, you're not talking about a 1% increase or a 2%. You're talking about 8, 10, 15, 20, 25%, depending on the size of your town. I forget, some of you haven't been around as long as I have. Was it Gilsum? Many, many years ago. One family moved into town that had some kids that needed special attention. And it added, I want to say, over $100,000 to a school budget. That wasn't even $1 million. One kid or one family. Federal government wouldn't help. The state had catastrophic aid, but it wasn't enough. My understanding is in my town of Marlboro, there's another family in town that have some kids that need some special attention, and it's going to increase our budget. One family, fairly substantially. Not their fault, certainly not the kids' fault, but it's a mandate. And because we pay for the schools with our property taxes, we're always going to have this intimidation. We're always going to have these arguments. We're always going to have these fights. People have to decide. They know they want good education for their kids, but they also want a fire department or they want their roads fixed. And by the way, they don't want their taxes to go up every single year. We yell at the mayor. We yell at the SAU 29 superintendent. We yell at the teachers union. We yell at the school board. We yell at the county. And yet it still goes back to the mandates. The state of New Hampshire, the second most wealthy state in the country, right? The federal government with their mandates. And they don't pay for it. Constitutionally, the state of New Hampshire, they have to provide an adequate education. And yet the system is property taxes. Why isn't there more of a fight about that? And as I've reminded you before, but not for quite a while, when you go to vote, and I'm not talking about in March, I'm talking about in November, you have an opportunity to vote for people who would change that system or keep it the way it is. Historically, in the state of New Hampshire, those who want to keep it the same, want to keep using the property tax, pay for everything, are the Republicans. Not all, but most. And yes, we've even had some Democrats and an opportunity for Jean Shaheen to change the way things were. And she didn't. I hear people complain and yell from the rafters. They call up and yell at me about their property taxes and the size of government, and it's outrageous. And then they go vote for the people who want to keep the system the way that it is now, particularly in the state of New Hampshire. Even though it is directly opposed to what would be best for their lives and their livelihood. Never understood that. Now, granted, a majority of the towns in Cheshire County in this area do send people to Concord who want to try to change things. But unfortunately, we come from a smaller part of the state, population-wise especially. Usually in the minority. And the people that send the majority are in places, to be quite honest, for the most part, are more property rich, or at least have the potential to be so. They are the ones closest to Boston. They're closer to the highway. They're closer to the trains. They're closer to the Mass border. They're closer to a giant lake in the middle of the state, or they're close to 7 miles of coastline and the towns that surround them. They have the money. They have the population. They have the influence. And therefore, they have the control. And that's why it's never been changed. 53 years old, been on the radio 35, almost 36 years. It's never changed. Never even come close. And yet people still are going to get mad at their school district meeting, and they're going to get mad at their town meeting. And by the way, get mad. That's fine. But look a little deeper as to what the problem is and why it is. Yes, it's spending. Absolutely. But it's also funding. And right now, your wallet is the only source of funding. Right? This broadcast And my words, almost identical to what we were talking about 25 years ago. But the good news is, we're probably going to get a 200-yard bike lane right down the side of Main Street in Keene. That'll fix problems, right? Last call coming up next. Your open mic show, 357-1290. We'll get to some of your emails, and we thank you for writing them. FM 107.5, AM 1290 on your smart speakers and smartphone at WKBKRadio.com. A little flirting with disaster. 357-1290. You can have the last word this morning if you want it. Tomorrow, a completely different subject. Celeste will be here doing astrological readings. Say, Celeste, I want to know a little bit about whether or not my property taxes will go down anytime in the next 10 years. You could ask her that. I'm sorry I get so fired up. Obviously, I'm opinionated about it. I mentioned, almost 36 years behind the microphone. And since day one, and even back when I was a DJ and we were playing music, we still had the opportunity to take phone calls and opinions and ideas. And I had an opportunity to begin hosting open mic, especially on weekends. And then the first ever afternoon edition of Open Mic that Tao and I put together, and we would always talk about schools, and we would talk about special ed, and we would talk about what teachers get paid, and we would talk about property taxes, we'd talk about sales taxes, we would talk about all of this. That much has not changed, and not much has changed in order to make it better or different. I am passionate about it. I've talked an awful lot about it, not just today, but in the past, and I like to think that I know a little bit about it. Doesn't mean I'm right, but, I've seen the history. I mentioned one of the most dramatic days I can remember being on the radio. I did the show from 10 to 2. I was on after Pat Desmarais. And Pat was on early, started at 5 o'clock. And we had just had the school district meeting a day or two before. Back then they had him at the middle school, and we would broadcast live from there, the old middle school auditorium. And he says, you're not going to believe this, but I'm starting to get some calls from parents that some teachers aren't going to go to school today. Big teachers contract at a time when they're, it was one of those recessionary times. We're getting raises their contract, 2 or 3 year contract. Anyway, it was voted down at the school district meeting back when they had the old way of doing it. They said no. And the teachers were not happy about it. And they pulled what was called a blue flu, where many started calling in to the SAU or to the principal saying, I'm not coming to school today. I don't feel well. And all of a sudden you had like 40 teachers who couldn't go to school, and they had to call off school. This happened the morning of school. So all of a sudden parents, like a snow day in a way, some had already started to drop their kids off at school, and some didn't have daycare for them, and it turned into a huge cluster. I might have been 2 days. It was at least one day when this happened. The backlash was incredible. This was, by the way, at a time when teachers really, really weren't paid a lot of money. And people were calling up. They were so mad that the teachers called in sick. It took a long time to get them a contract, and it took them a long time to earn back the trust of the voters. Some would say that was a negative reason for having the town meeting type of school district meetings. Others would say, no, that's the reason that it's good. Because even though the teachers didn't agree with the decision, and their spouses and others, at the time it might have been the right decision economically or fiscally. Or maybe it was time for the school board to adjust their spending and their revenues in order to make sure they could give teachers more money, but not spend a lot on the other end of things. It was great for talk radio. It was wicked. By the way, Pat and I were in disagreement. Pat really was for the Australian ballot and not giving the teachers raises. I was for giving the teachers raises and not for the Australian ballot. Well, made for really good talk radio. Still does, I think. A little bit of history for you. And I know that there are some teachers, maybe some that still teach, that remember that. I want to say it was, 1986, 88? Around in that, mid to late 80s. Before 1990, I think. It was right around in that time span. Anyway, we'll talk more about it tomorrow. I didn't get to all of your emails. As a matter of fact, there are a lot more coming in. Some of you like what I said, and some of you are being pretty nasty about it. That's okay. Good thing they're emails and you're not on the phone. We'll see you back here tomorrow. As always, thanks for participating. Thanks for being part of the most interesting and interested radio audiences around Cheshire County. Again, if you have something to say and we don't have time to have you say it on the phone, email me, Dan at WKBKRadio.com.